Tonight is going to be a conversation about disaster capitalism, the history of colonization, and why these are the first disasters, but I'll save those juicy points for later. Before we get into that, would you all mind, those of you who are comfortable, closing your eyes for just a moment and going deep into yourself or outside of that self with us now? With your eyes closed, begin to imagine roots at your base. Follow those roots down, deep into the ground. See those roots intertwining with the roots next to you. Think about those waterways, those deep chasms underground that bear life. How connected to those are you? Who else has been connected to those waters? Continue to expand farther and farther out to all of the lands that you've treaded, all of the waters you've drank from, all of your relations, all of your connections. And now follow those roots back here. Remember the places that you've been and the people who have been on those lands too. I'm curious if anybody knows the names of the ancestral peoples of these lands, the people who are still fighting on them.
Halapuya.
Thank you all for invoking those names into this room. Before we get started, I really just want to acknowledge the land, the air, the water, and the fire, these elements that bring us all here, that connect us, these things that have been fought for, these things that continually perpetuate the life that we have, and to celebrate all of our relations, those who have fought before that allow us to be in this space right now.
So I'm going to give you a really quick overview of what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk a little bit about who on earth Matter Mutual Aid Disaster Relief is, and then give our stories of mutual aid, just a little taste of what it means to each of us. And then we're going to go through the heavy stuff, the tactics of disaster capitalism, get into the nitty-gritty, and then come out on the other side with a timeline of the development of mutual aid disaster relief as a concept, as a tactic, and as a network. But now, who Matter is?
That's a big question. We're still trying to figure that out. The network has only really existed for a couple of years, but to get into the meat of what this network is supposed to be, it's a decentralized network of communities uplifting each other in their grassroots movements and efforts during, before, and after crisis moments. We like to think that there are two different types of disasters. There's the visible disasters, or the acute ones, that we'll continue to mention about tonight. And there are the ongoing invisible disasters, or these really obtuse ones that we're always hoping to fight constantly and compost these different systems while we're nurturing the seeds of the world that we want to grow.
Yeah, so this is just our second tour, and like Peyton said, we've just been around since 2016. So in the spring we did an East Coast tour and got to visit some really rad communities there. And then this is our fall tour on the West Coast, and our network is mostly based right now on the East Coast and in the Gulf, and we have a lot of experience mostly responding to hurricanes and floods, so we've been learning a lot about some of the things y'all have been learning about responding to fires and droughts and some of the other disasters that are unique to this area. There's a lot that we have gone through figuring out like what we can spend this hour or these 2 hours with y'all talking about. And I think we've kind of boiled it down after this like month and a half on the road so far of really just wanting to share this like spirit of mutualism that we want to engage with when we enter disasters and respond to them. And then we also want to learn from these acute disaster responses and see what we can like stretch out of that, all that momentum and energy that gets put into responding to those acute disasters. We like to give y'all a little bit of a timeline to give you a sense of kind of where we're coming from and what experience this network has been pulling from, some of the lessons that we've learned, which we talk a lot more about tomorrow in depth. We start off by saying that shit is getting worse. In case y'all haven't heard, it's really scary. IPCC just released a report that we have about 12 years to figure this shit out, and it's true, the disasters are ramping up in frequency and in magnitude. We need to prepare ourselves. We need to prepare ourselves tactically, emotionally, psychologically, collectively, and we really hope that by building this network that we can start building these bridges across the country So we start our story with Common Ground, which was a collective that formed in 2005 after Katrina hit New Orleans. And it was created mostly by a former Black Panther named Malik Raheem. And Common Ground did a lot. They had dozens of different types of survival programs that they were doing, and they were very inspired by the Black Panthers' use of survival programs. People think that the Black Panthers were a threat to the state because of their guns, but it was really the survival programs that they had curated, and these systems of mutual aid and the ways that they were able to support themselves and protect themselves that made them a real threat. So in Common Ground, we see this continuation of this use of survival programs. Common Ground did so many different types of programs, they kind of got lost in it. They had millions of dollars flowing in. They had tens of thousands of volunteers coming in, mostly like white college students on their spring break trying to help out. And their effect on New Orleans, well, it was an interesting one. It's one that we draw a lot of lessons from. Some of the people in our network helped participate in the Common Ground Collective and experienced a lot of different issues there. With so much money and so many people and so many different programs going on, this attempt at making a decentralized horizontal collective didn't really work. It just, when things expand that fast and you're doing so much, it's really hard to maintain group buy-in and decision-making processes, and to make sure that you're protecting yourself against the patriarchy and the racism that we're trying to uproot in our recovery efforts. But we learned a lot. A lot of people were from the anti-globalization movement and had previously learned how to cook like a huge amount of meals for hundreds of people, doing street medic work, doing independent media work. These are all skills that we're building and using when disasters hit.
In 2010, the earthquake that rocked Haiti saw a lot of different responses. The state had its responses, the nonprofit industrial complex, we could call them responses. So we can see these different lapses. We have to be very candid also in saying that there were lapses in the way that people like us, people who are going to these really sexy 2-hour and 8-hour workshops on mutual aid and survival tactics through revolutionary fervors, also fall into these traps of missionary complex and the savior complex and disaster patriarchy as well. The first time that mutual aid disaster relief was used as a name was in response to this. There was a bunch of people who kind of came out of these movements of, like Leah said, the anti-globalization era, people who had a lot of skills, people who had affinity with each other, and they wanted to do what they could to help out this people in need. And so they went down, and they had very little connection. They had a really hard time finding their way, not just through the language, but also through the culture too. The state has a different tactic, the institutions have different tactics, and the people themselves hold each other in a completely different way than these activists were ready and prepared to handle. And so that mission wasn't necessarily a success in the way that they thought it was going to be, but it gave us a lot of insight into how this current iteration of mutual aid disaster relief operates. We don't send people out of country, we don't send people anywhere. We're a bunch of people who are all working together and uplifting each other's struggles. We're not an organization that administers aid. We're one that is us. Everyone in this room, everyone who we're connected with, is doing the damn thing. We are mutual aid disaster relief, and that's a very powerful thing to think about. It's also a very daunting thing to think about, because who the hell are we, right? We have to identify who we are to each other and with ourselves, and that's building trust. And so that's a lot of why we're doing this right now, is to not make those same mistakes. We can think then also about the Baton Rouge floods that hit Louisiana in 2016. These floods were met by a group of people who came from the community this time, and they self-identified as mutual aid disaster relief. This was the second time that people used this tactic and this name in a really real way. They were leading their own recovery. In this image here, we can see all of these different types of people coming from different backgrounds, wearing different shirts, different signifiers, using their diversity of tactics, using their different community resources to pool these things together and build popular power in the movement, in the relief of this large disaster that hit their community. They were doing this so successfully that when Standing Rock began and water protectors were going to fight the state and to protect their land, they were able to send up from Louisiana a bunch of extra gas masks and respirators for people who were fighting in this struggle as well. So we can see the interrelation of these different parts. And that's a lot of how we're trying to move with this network today. Not just taking care of ourselves and our homes, but being able to push and pull each other in the direction towards collective liberation.
2017 was a big year for disasters. We saw 6 major disasters in this country in the span of 3 months. including the major fires that hit over here on the West Coast, which we've been learning about. But we're going to talk about the hurricanes because that's where we've been interacting and experiencing. The first that hit was Harvey in Houston at the end of August. And it was super destructive. We saw response by the aid organizations and the military in doing rescues, but they were in predominantly white and middle and upper middle class neighborhoods, and that continued throughout the recovery period of those neighborhoods and those classes receiving the support. Whereas the predominantly black and brown and lower income and historically marginalized neighborhoods were left to fend for themselves. Which they did. There's like so many people took their boats out of their garages and went and did rescues. And that was really inspiring to see people activated in that way because they had to be. And it took a long time before we saw Red Cross and Salvation Army giving out meals in these neighborhoods that were food deserts and where the only superstore was closed up for weeks on end. So West Street Recovery, the organization that I'm part of, we were starting to mobilize, and Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, the network, reached out to us a couple days after the flood. They had just been looking out for autonomous groups that were reacting on a grassroots level and found us through Facebook or GoFundMe or something like that, and reached out to us to ask how they could support us. And so they ended up sending us an Amazon wish list of supplies that they plugged through their network, so we had tons of gear for mucking and gutting homes coming to our address before we were actually at that phase of things. And they were also this great resource for us to call and be like, ask these questions of like, well, how long does it take to muck and gut a home? And, what do these phases look like and how long are they? And they were really supportive in that way. Next, we saw in Florida, Hurricane Irma hit a couple days later. A lot of the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief members actually live in Tampa, and the hurricane was expected to hit really hard in Tampa, but it actually went a bit south and hit in particular a town called Immokalee, where there's a really amazing farm workers advocacy collective called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief folks had a good relationship with this coalition previously, and so when the hurricane hit, they were able to start redirecting supplies down from Tampa down to Immokalee workers and let them continue to be the face of their recovery. And then we saw Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico a couple weeks later, and this one was like insanely devastating. 80 to 90% of structures were damaged in this storm, and electricity was cut off for some months. We draw a lot of inspiration from Puerto Rico because these Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, or CAMs, Centers of Mutual Aid, popped up. There were 11 of them. One of them formed because somebody had a gas stove, whereas everybody else had electric stoves when the electricity was out, and so it was just the place where everybody could cook large meals for their neighbors. And two of them occupied school buildings and started meeting people's needs that way. And currently there's 7 of them still going on today. So the way that the network got to engage with them is the network had some members that had family members in Puerto Rico, and so they went to go check up on them along with some trained medics, and made 2 successive trips after that down to Puerto Rico. They did a lot of fundraising, so they were able to bring down a water filtration system that got passed along to each of these CAMs and is still in rotation today. And then they also got a solar company to bring down this huge solar pad system that can be packed away in case of the next hurricane that comes. At this point, we see the state really asking for their, the school property back. And we recognize that in forming these mutual aid systems, we are very much a threat to the state and their narrative and control over us. And it's very helpful that we are out rescuing each other in the initial phases of a disaster, but there definitely comes a point where we're seeing the state respond by saying, okay, like, give us our school back, and like, okay, you can stop now, and it's like, no, we're not going to, we're going to keep going. They don't like that.
When Hurricane Florence hit, we can see as these little bees are creating homes for other insects, which I think is a really, really amazing image and a really nice thought to think of. That in the wake of these disasters, people come together, these pre-existing networks that already happen to be there, from farm worker solidarity collectives to one medicine collective in particular titled the Blue Ridge Autonomous Defense came out and were working in tandem with other people in their community to meet their own needs. One of the more spectacular things that happened out of Hurricane Florence response was because the area was hit so heavily, Wilmington became an island. There was no way to come in or out by vehicle, at least not on the ground. And so about 60 different pilots or 60 different trips of individual single-engine planes came into the city, delivering within just the course of a couple of days 50,000 pounds of food and other materials to people in that area. This is before FEMA, this is before the Red Cross came. We'll talk a lot about narratives and how we protect ourselves and continue to create our own narratives through this, not just today, but also tomorrow as well. One lesson that we learned from this is that the people who were coming in were not all anarchists. They were not all people who identified as mutual aid disaster relief. So it's very important for us not to co-opt these things and say that it's the anarchists that did the damn thing, and that we, once again, because we went to the really sexy 2-hour lecture and the 8-hour workshop the next day, are the ones who are the harbingers of mutual aid, because that's just incorrect. We're going to tell a couple stories about where we're coming from as activists and how we got connected to this work.
I really love to share this story about a family that the group that I'm part of that formed in response to Harvey got to meet. The group I'm part of is called West Street Recovery. We were up in the neighborhoods distributing supplies at some point after the hurricane, and we met this family that was using their driveway as a distribution center. So they were collecting the excess that their neighbors had of supplies and whatever else they could get their hands on, and then redistributing it out to their neighbors and distributing info to their neighbors. And so we started interfacing with them and trying to figure out what they needed and how we could support them the best. And so they'd say, oh, we need 3 mattresses, or we need some fans, and so we get that to them, and they could continue being the face of their recovery effort up there. So as we got to know this family, we learned that Petra and Raul and their 2 adult children and 2 grandchildren were all living in tents in their driveway. And it was getting colder and colder, and FEMA and the aid institutions were giving them the runaround in the application process for financial support to rebuild their home. And as it was getting colder, they were saying, we just need 1 room in our house that's insulated and had drywall in it so that we can be secure and start moving forward on our recovery. So we got the supplies because we had some financial resources, and he taught us how to drywall one of his rooms. And then we kind of kept going on his house, but we were also in communication with all these other families that also were in really similar situations. They weren't getting help, it was cold, they had health issues, that sort of thing. And so Raul, like long before Petra and Raul's house was finished, like anywhere close to finished, Raul would join us on our cruise and help us like put parts of people's homes back together, like just like in this effort to kind of get people unstuck and like move forward in their recovery, like on a like case-by-case basis. And then Petra, meanwhile, would cook these like bomb-ass Mexican food meals and invite everybody over. So even when we weren't working on their house, like 20 of us volunteers would like all go over to their house and we'd share food together. And that was just like a really special relationship that we formed. Fast forward, it's over a year after Harvey hit last August, and Raul is still working with us. We finally got him to accept some money for some of the jobs that he's doing. We just got a grant, and he's one of 4 people on kind of like this main team that's continuing to do these rebuild projects. This family was just like really influential in our understanding of like what mutual aid looked like, because Petra and Raul were already working in mutual aid for their community and neighborhood when we met them. And our role very much got to be just supporting them and their immediate needs with the resources that we could get our hands on so that they could do that on a broader scale. And another thing that we got to do for them, we feel like, is provide some of the vocabulary so that they could continue to be like more effective advocates of these concepts. And now Raul these days talks in terms of like mutual aid and solidarity.
Like I said earlier, I organized with a group called Solidarity and Defense out of Michigan. We got word that Richard Spencer was going to be coming to our state. He was going on a college speaking tour. Richard Spencer is a person who believes that, very much like David Duke from the Ku Klux Klan, that the suit and tie approach to white supremacy is the more successful one, that people who are able to find themselves in positions of power and legitimize white supremacy can create what he believes and calls an ethno state, or a state in which only white people reside while all of the rest of us are kicked out. And we can understand exactly what those tactics would be. We've seen this in history before, and so anti-fascist, anti-racist action is an antithesis to this. People are mobilizing against not just people like Richard Spencer, but these institutional forms as well. He was notorious, along with a bunch of other people, for going to the University of Richmond in Virginia last year, which is in Charlottesville. There was one person who was murdered by a white supremacist there after a lot of counter demonstrations. Her name was Heather Hare, and we're memorializing her still to this day. And when we heard that he was going to be coming to our state, we had about 4 months of time to prepare. So we started reaching out to our community. We started remembering things that had been somewhat lost in our greater movement. And this image is inspired by a shot that was taken in 1998. This was the last time that white supremacists were able to march in the streets of Ann Arbor. This image was captured and turned into a silhouette. It's now referred to as the Good Night White Pride image. And so what we did, instead of trying to create this like large mobilization to just fight the Nazis, we wanted to get out popular power. So we reached out into all of our relations in the greater Midwest. We created a set of principles. We were remembering these images and holding them, and we were creating and integrating a larger narrative of anti-racist, anti-fascist, and anti-colonial action. So at the same time that we were preparing for this, the Larry Nassar scandal was unfortunately happening as well at the Michigan State University, which is where Richard Spencer was going to be speaking. We were able to integrate that into our anti-patriarchal approach as well, into our narrative, and the Flint water crisis was still happening, so we were able to integrate that into our narrative as well. This was not just Richard Spencer, but it was a multifaceted, intersectional approach that we were able to create, and that was leading us to call what we had that day of resistance a festival of resistance. We had clowns, we had people with brass bands, we had clergy, we had students, we had teachers, we had parents of students, we had people who were black blocked up, with an intersectional approach. When we had a diversity of tactics, when we had mutual aid in our coalition building, we had a successful day where we were able to stop the Nazis from getting in and having their talk the next day. Richard Spencer, after getting literally ran out of the state of Michigan, said that the college speaking tour wasn't any fun anymore and that he was going to cancel it. I don't say this to pride, solidarity, and defense. It wasn't just us out there that day. It was us working with a bunch of other people, but it's because of the coalition building that we were doing across the state of Michigan, because of the work that we were doing in tandem with all of our comrades and all of the people who were activated by this moment, common people coming out and showing up the diversity and the celebration of that thing that really stopped this disaster from coming into our community, and we're still building on those relations to this day.
As I said before, I'm from Menominee Land, southeastern Wisconsin. I'm also from the most conservative county in Wisconsin, and that means semi-rural, white, upper middle class folks. And I grew up with my full-on privilege blinders on. Had no sense of mutual aid. Our neighbors were people that we knew their names, but you said hi to them and you didn't really do anything else. There were no networks of meeting each other's needs. And one day when I was a teenager, a really bad snowstorm hit, and I remember driving my brother's friends home and coming across this car that was stuck on a pretty sketchy precipice. And this instigated a 3-4 hour process of calling neighbors, people down the street, figuring out who had salt, who was okay with having their car parked, where, who could stay at whose house, who had food to feed who. So one of the points that we're going to make to you today a lot is that mutual aid is our default behavior, that it's what we go to, and it's our humanity, and it's natural. We do this so that we can prepare better, because if we really know what's coming and can see from other disasters, then we can prepare better and we can respond better. And we can be more effective in our decentralized grassroots relief efforts and our ongoing organizing and how those work together.